The train hissed and groaned as it slowed to a stop at the dusty little station of Dry Creek. Clara stepped down onto the platform with trembling hands and a hopeful heart, her boots kicking up dry red earth. Her dress was modest, her hair pinned neat, and the small trunk beside her held everything she owned: some hand-sewn dresses, a worn Bible, and a small photograph of her mother. She had taken the long journey west not just for a new home, but for a chance at redemption. She had answered the ad carefully clipped from a Kansas paper. Rancher seeks God-fearing, hard-working bride. Must be willing to live in quiet country. Prior life no concern, heart and honesty valued most. It was signed simply, Thomas W. Randall. Dry Creek. Clara had clutched that letter like a lifeline. For years she'd sung in the crowded, smoke-filled saloons of Wichita, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only place that paid a girl with no family and no options. Her voice had kept her fed, but it had also earned her a reputation she couldn't shake. That reputation followed her everywhere. No matter how clean she dressed or how soft her voice became, she thought maybe, just maybe, someone like Thomas Randall could see past it. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward from the cluster of townsfolk at the platform. He wore a clean white shirt under a tan vest, and his boots were polished, his hat low over his brow. Clara recognized him from the photograph he had sent her. Her heart lifted. "Mr. Randall?" she asked, smiling nervously. He looked at her. His eyes, dark and narrow, ran from her face to her dress to the small trunk at her feet, and then his jaw stiffened. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't offer his hand. His lips moved, barely. "You didn't say you were that Clara Barnes." Clara blinked. "I didn't think it mattered." "It does," he muttered. "I don't bring scandal to my ranch." And just like that, he turned around, climbed onto his waiting horse, and rode away. Dust rose behind him like smoke from a burning bridge. Clara stood frozen on the platform, surrounded by onlookers pretending not to stare but failing miserably. The station master looked at her with quiet pity. A woman in a gray bonnet whispered to another. A young boy pointed and laughed before his mother pulled him away. The train let out a long, final whistle before rumbling on toward the horizon, leaving Clara completely alone. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she picked up her trunk and walked to the edge of the platform, then sat down on the hard wooden bench. She sat there as the afternoon light turned gold, then orange, then blue. One by one, the townsfolk went about their business, leaving her to the crickets and the rustling wind. She remembered Wichita. She remembered the way men had thrown coins at her feet, how women had looked at her like she was dirt under their boots. She remembered how cold it felt when she finally walked out of that saloon and swore she'd never go back, not ever. But now, that promise seemed foolish. She had nowhere to stay, no money left, no future. She'd risk everything to become someone new, and it had taken less than 60 seconds for Thomas Randall to tear it all down with one judgmental glance. As darkness settled, Clara finally let herself cry, quietly, shoulders shaking. Not loud, not bitter, just tired. And yet, in the shadows near the horse trough, someone watched. Eli Morgan had come into town only to pick up supplies, feed, nails, and medicine for his ailing mother. But when he saw Clara on that platform, standing tall as the man rejected her, something in him stirred. He knew what it was like to be discarded, to be left behind by life. He'd buried a wife. He'd buried a child. And somewhere along the way, he'd buried his voice too. He didn't speak to Clara that night. He simply leaned against the wooden post, chewing the edge of his glove, watching as she sat alone with the weight of a broken dream in her lap. By the time the stars were out, Clara was still sitting there, her hands clasped tight over her trunk, like a child clutching a lifeboat. She didn't know it yet, but her life had just turned a corner, and the quiet cowboy was watching, waiting, thinking, because maybe, just maybe, he believed in second chances too. The sun rose over Dry Creek, with the kind of unforgiving light only the West could offer, clear, hot, and revealing. Clara was still sitting on the bench at the train station, her back stiff, her hands curled tight in her lap, and her small trunk beside her like a gravestone to her last hope. She hadn't slept. She hadn't even moved much. Her dreams had died in front of strangers, and she didn't know what to do next. Her mind repeated the moment like a cruel song. You didn't say you were that Clara Barnes. That, as if her name had poison on it. The town stirred slowly. A milk wagon clattered down the main street. A dog barked. The church bell rang, once distant, mournful. The shopkeepers began sweeping their porches. A few glanced her way and quickly looked back down. She wasn't invisible, she was a stain, and they didn't want it rubbing off on them. Clara forced herself to stand. Her body ached from the cold bench and the weight of disappointment. She tried to carry her trunk, but her arms trembled, so she dragged it to the corner of the station, away from the center of town. That's when she saw the first kindness of the day, a cup of coffee, still warm, placed on the bench where she had been sitting. No note, no voice. Just left there for her. She looked around. The street was mostly empty. She didn't know who had left it, but she drank it anyway. Her pride had taken enough hits. One more didn't matter. Around mid-morning, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Abigail Denning, approached. She was proper, sharp-featured, dressed in fine calico and lace gloves even in the heat. My husband said you might be hungry, she said, offering a wrapped biscuit. I won't offer you a room, but you can eat. Clara nodded. Thank you. Mrs. Denning sat beside her, but didn't look directly at her. We all have pasts. But your kind of past tends to make decent folk nervous. Clara blinked. I'm not dangerous. You don't have to be. Temptation is dangerous enough. Clara said nothing. She'd heard this before, just in nicer words. After a pause, the woman added, You should go back east, or maybe south. There's nothing for you here. Clara thanked her again, voice low. Mrs. Denning stood, adjusted her gloves, and walked away. An hour later, Mr. Jeffries, the general store owner, stepped out to shake the dirt off a rug. He spotted Clara and frowned. You can't sleep there again tonight, miss. The town council will have a word if you linger too long. I understand, she said quietly. She dragged her trunk to the edge of town by early afternoon, toward the cottonwood trees that lined the river. A few children followed at a distance, giggling and pointing. A teenage boy shouted, Sing! U.S. a song, Saloon girl. Before someone, maybe his mother, called him off, she kept walking. When she reached the riverbank, Clara found a small flat patch near the trees. The shade gave her some relief. She opened her trunk, pulled out a worn quilt, and laid it down like it was a bed in a fine hotel. She sat cross-legged on it, hands in her lap. She had no tent, no firewood, no plan, but she had dignity. She was not going to go back to that saloon in Wichita. She had burned that bridge. She'd rather sleep beside coyotes than serve another. Drink to a drunk who thought her worth was measured in tips and touches. That night, the cold seeped in again. The stars above her glittered indifferently. She sang quietly to herself, almost a whisper, a lullaby her mother once sang to her when life was easier and full of stories. Instead of silence, she didn't know that across the river, Eli Morgan sat on horseback beneath the trees, watching from a distance. Again, he hadn't told anyone, not his ranch hands, not even his mother. But every night since seeing her arrive, he rode the edge of town near sundown, watching her. She didn't beg, she didn't yell. She didn't try to earn sympathy. She endured. That kind of strength was rare. The next morning, Clara woke to find something beside her quilt, a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside it were 2 biscuits, a flask of water, and a pair of wool socks, men's socks. She touched the fabric like it was made of gold. No name, no note, but someone was watching. Someone who hadn't turned away, and for the first time in days, Clara allowed herself to believe she might not be entirely alone after all. Clara never saw him at first. She only noticed little signs, like the fresh apples that appeared on a flat rock near her quilt one morning, or the pile of firewood stacked neatly near her riverbed shelter on a rainy night. No one came close. No one spoke. But someone was there. Each morning, she woke a little stronger. Each evening, she laid her head down knowing, without proof, that she was being quietly protected. And she was right. Because across the creek, under the shadow of the cottonwoods, Eli Morgan watched her. He wasn't a man of many words. He hadn't always been that way. There was a time when he was easy with a smile, fast with a joke. But that was before the fever took his wife and infant son in the same week. That grief hollowed him out like fire through timber. Now, Eli preferred silence to speech, solitude to town gatherings. The townsfolk respected him. He was one of the richest ranchers for miles, but they didn't know him. Not anymore, but something in Clara Barnes drew him. He remembered the moment she stepped off the train. He'd been tying his horse outside the dry goods store when he saw her dark blue dress, gloved hands, standing tall even as her supposed groom rejected her in front of everyone. Eli had watched her face carefully. Not a tear, not a protest. Just a quiet sort of heartbreak buried deep behind her eyes. A woman who'd learned how to hold herself together even as she unraveled inside. Eli knew that kind of strength. He lived it every day. She never once begged for help, never once came knocking on a single door in Dry Creek. And because of that, the town dismissed her even faster. Eli had seen this place eat up newcomers before, especially women with a shadowed past. It was a place built on tradition, on appearances. And Clara didn't fit. But he couldn't stop thinking about her. So he began to ride out at dusk, crossing through the north pasture, past the gulch, and down to the bend in the river where the cottonwoods grew. From there, he could see her small camp, the quilt, the fire pit she tried to build with scattered stones, her trunk used as a table, sometimes a pillow. He watched her wash her clothes in the creek, wring them out with practiced hands. He watched her hum softly to herself as she stitched repairs into her dress. One night, he saw her pray, kneeling by the river, her back straight, eyes closed. She never saw him. But that was the way Eli preferred things. He didn't know what he intended. He wasn't looking for a wife. Lord knew his heart hadn't healed enough for that. But there was something inside him that refused to let her suffer alone. So he left what he could. Firewood, food, a blanket, a second-hand kettle he hadn't used in years, never more than one item at a time. He didn't want to frighten her. He just wanted to ease the burden she carried. One night, he brought his old hound, Rufus, with him on the ride. The dog had taken to watching Clara too, ears perked every time Eli neared the river. That evening, Rufus wandered closer to her camp than usual. Clara spotted the dog and smiled. "Well, hello," she said, kneeling. "You've been the one bringing me gifts, haven't you?" She scratched behind the dog's ears as he leaned into her. From across the river, hidden in the trees, Eli felt something tighten in his chest. That smile, it was small, but real. It lit her face in a way he hadn't seen before. And it reminded him of something warm, something long gone. He considered turning back, but Rufus had already given him away. Clara stood, peering into the darkness beyond the creek. Her eyes scanned the trees. "You don't have to hide," she called gently. "I won't bite." Eli didn't move. She waited a moment longer, then said, softer, "Thank you, whoever you are." Then she sat down by the fire, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, and began to hum. The sound was faint, something from another life, slow and aching. Eli stayed a while longer, hidden by the dark, listening to her song until the stars came out. That night, as he rode home, he finally said something aloud to the quiet wind. She doesn't belong out there. And for the first time since burying his family, Eli Morgan started to think about making room in his life again. Not for charity, not for guilt, but for the kind of woman who had been through the fire and still dared to sing by the river. Clara was learning how to survive with nothing. She had always been resourceful. That's what life in the saloon had demanded. But the freedom of this exile along the river was a different kind of challenge. There were no walls, no shelter, no steady food, no roof to keep off the rain, no music to distract from the loneliness, but there was also no one demanding she smile for a tip. Number. When grabbing her wrist or calling her name she didn't deserve, she had silence, and she had stars. Still, the days were hard. She scavenged what she could. Wild berries near the riverbank, edible roots a kind widow had once shown her on a wagon trail. She boiled water over a small fire pit made from old stones. Her boots were beginning to crack from the heat and wear. Her hands had blistered from trying to mend branches into makeshift shelter. She tried to stay out of sight. Each time she went into town for a scrap of cloth or an odd sewing job, the eyes followed her. Some of the townsfolk stared openly, others pretended not to notice, but she felt their judgment like wind pressing against her back. The hardest blow came on a Thursday morning. Clara had walked into Dry Creek to buy a spool of thread with the last of her coins. She passed the barber shop where three men lounged outside, smoking and talking loud. One of them, a man with a crooked smile and narrow eyes, called out, "Dry Creek sure has a new kind of tent girl." The others chuckled. Clara didn't stop walking, didn't look back. But the words stuck like barbs in her skin. She left the shop with thread in hand and returned to her camp by midday. Her steps dragged in the dirt. Her head ached. She sat under the cottonwoods and stared at the river, wondering if she'd made a mistake not returning to Wichita. There, at least, she knew what to expect. Here, they didn't just hate her. They made her feel like a ghost. That evening, she tried to sew a tear in her only warm skirt, but her fingers shook too badly. Frustrated, she threw the needle into the dirt, and that's when she heard the sound laughter. Boys. She turned just in time to see three teenage boys on the ridge above the riverbank. One of them threw a rock. It didn't hit her, but landed near the fire pit, scattering the stones. Another shouted, "Sing us something, saloon girl. Bet you miss dancing on tables." They jeered, laughed, and ran off before she could even stand. She sank to her knees, chest heaving not from fear, but from fury. Rage filled her throat like smoke, not because they'd scared her, but because she was tired. So tired of being seen as something less than human. She didn't cry. She stood up and rebuilt the fire pit. Then she picked up the stone the boy had thrown and placed it right at the center. A reminder, a marker, proof that she had lived through worse. As she worked, she didn't notice the horse approaching. The quiet clop of hooves came closer, then stopped a few feet from her tent. She turned slowly. There he was, the man with the kind eyes who had never spoken to her, but had left her food and wood. He was tall, dressed in plain clothes, and wore a tan hat that shaded half his face. His presence didn't startle her. It calmed her. "You've been watching me," she said softly. He nodded once. She straightened. "I don't need your pity." "I know," he replied. His voice was deeper than she imagined. Low, even, steady as river stone. She waited. When he didn't say more, she asked, "Why help me then?" Eli looked past her at the fire pit she'd rebuilt. "Because no one else will. And because you haven't asked for anything." That silenced her. He reached behind him and brought down a rolled canvas from the back of his saddle. "It's a tent," he said. "Small, but better than nothing." Clara stared at it, then at him. "Why?" He hesitated before answering. "My mother's getting older. She needs help. I need someone I can trust. I figured you might take the job." Clara blinked. "You're offering me work?" He nodded. Her voice cracked. "You don't care what they say about me?" "I care what I see," he said simply, and what he saw was a woman the town had tried to break, but hadn't. A woman who still stood tall, still rebuilt her fire, and still dared to hope, even when hope came in the shape of a stranger and a canvas tent. She stepped forward and took the rolled tent from him, holding it gently. Then she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Eli Morgan tipped his hat and rode off without another word. But behind her, Clara unrolled the canvas and began staking it to the ground. Her first shelter, her first hired job, and maybe the start of something she never dared wish for again. The sun had barely crested over the hills when Clara stepped out of her tent the next morning. The canvas Eli had given her was old but strong, no holes, no tears, and it had kept the cold out for the first time in weeks. She touched the canvas edge with quiet reverence, whispering a silent thank you. Not just for the shelter, but for something far rarer in Dry Creek, dignity. She hadn't seen Eli since he rode off the night before. He hadn't stayed to explain himself, hadn't lingered for praise. He'd made his offer simply and left like a man who wasn't trying to save her, just offering something fair. A job. Clara didn't know what kind of work he truly had in mind. She only knew she couldn't turn it down. Not after being treated like dirt by half the town. She didn't want charity, but she needed a place where she could be useful. So she washed her face in the river, braided her hair, and dressed in the neatest clothes she had left. Then she packed her trunk with steady hands, rolled up her quilt, and broke down the tent. For the first time since she arrived in Dry Creek, she wasn't moving because she was unwanted. She was moving because someone had asked her to. By noon, she walked the dusty path toward the Morgan Ranch. It was larger than she imagined, dozens of acres stretching out over soft hills, with a white-fenced corral, barns in neat rows, and cattle grazing far in the distance. Ranch hands moved in the distance, but no one paid her any mind. She paused at the edge of the main house, a wide, two-story home with faded blue shutters and a porch that creaked in the breeze. Eli stepped out of the barn just then, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes met hers without surprise. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He nodded toward the porch. "Ma's inside." "I'll show you in." Clara followed him up the steps, heart pounding. Inside, the house was quiet, warm, and worn, with years of life. The furniture was simple, the walls lined with old photos and stitched samplers. A single grandfather clock ticked in the hall. In a small back room, an older woman lay in a bed surrounded by books, knitted blankets, and a half-finished quilt in a hoop. "This is my mother," Eli said softly. "Eleanor." Eleanor Morgan turned her head slowly, her gray hair pinned back, her eyes sharp despite the deep wrinkles around them. She looked Clara up and down, then smiled faintly. "So you're the saloon girl?" Clara's stomach twisted. "Yes, ma'am." "You're also the one who didn't beg, didn't run, and still managed to make yourself useful. I admire that." Clara blinked. "I was a mill girl before I became a ranch wife," Eleanor continued. "People used to look at me like I was half wild. You don't need their approval, just your own." Eli cleared his throat. "Ma needs help bathing, cooking, reading letters." "I can't keep up with it all." Clara stepped forward slowly. I've done caregiving before, at the boarding house in Wichita. I can do this, if you'll have me." Eleanor grinned. "Oh, I'll have you. I like a woman who can stand on her own 2 feet." From that moment, it was settled. Eli gave her the guest. Room in the back of the house modest, with a small window and a clean bed. Clara unpacked her things with quiet gratitude. She still wasn't sure why Eli had chosen her, but the opportunity felt like something solid beneath her feet for the first time in years. Over the next few days, Clara settled into a rhythm. She cooked simple meals from the Morgan family pantry, read aloud to Eleanor from old letters and dime novels, and rubbed balm into the old woman's aching joints every evening. Eleanor, in turn, told stories, wild, beautiful tales about surviving tornadoes, raising boys, and chasing off cattle rustlers with a shotgun in her lap. Eli came and went, always quiet, always working. But Clara noticed the way he paused sometimes, at the kitchen door when she laughed at one of Eleanor's stories, or the way his gaze lingered a moment longer when she tied her apron or stirred a pot. He never said much, but he was always there. And the town. Well, the town noticed. Whispers floated through the general store and church pews. The Saloon girl's living with the Morgans now. Helping the old woman, is she? Or working her way into the will? That boy's lost his mind. But Clara didn't care, because for the first time since stepping off that cursed train, she was more than her reputation. She was needed, trusted, safe, and even though he hadn't said it, she could feel it every time Eli handed her a new task or brought back a spool of thread without being asked. He saw her, not for her past, but for who she was becoming. Clara had never known quiet could be so comforting, not the awkward silence of strangers avoiding her, or the forced hush of saloon rooms after a drunken outburst, but a deep natural stillness that filled the land like breath. At Morgan Creek, the silence wasn't empty. It had shape, rhythm, purpose, and over time she began to fall into step with it. Each morning, Clara rose before the sun, the cool air brushing her cheeks as she tied her hair back and stepped into her simple leather shoes. The smell of dew on dry grass greeted her first. Then came the soft creak of the ranch house, the hiss of the kettle, and the slow waking groan of Martha Morgan from her rocker by the hearth. Martha had grown to trust her quickly. The old woman was sharp-tongued and stubborn, but Clara learned how to meet her moods with quiet strength. She knew when to speak and when to listen, when to lace Martha's tea with willow bark for her pain, and when to heat cloths for her swollen knees. Sometimes Clara would hum softly as she worked, nothing grand, just old lullabies or forgotten melodies from her childhood. She hadn't realized how much she missed singing until the ranch house began to feel safe. One morning, while she was sweeping the front porch, Eli rode in from the north pasture. His shirt was damp with sweat, his brow shaded by his hat, and his horse looked winded. He didn't say anything at first, he rarely did, but he stopped at the porch steps and looked up at her. "You sing when you think no one's listening," he said. Clara straightened, caught off guard. "I suppose I do. It's nice." Then he walked into the house, and Clara stood there, her cheeks warm not from the sun, but from something else. He'd never complimented her before, never commented on her past or her presence. Just, "It's nice." Simple, quiet, real. That night she couldn't sleep. She stepped outside the back door, wrapped in her shawl, and stood under the stars. The prairie stretched out in silver lines beneath the moon, endless and open. Eli was sitting by the barn, sharpening a knife. He looked up but didn't move. Clara took a few steps toward him. "You always work this late?" "Sometimes. Can't sleep." "Me neither." A pause. "I used to sing on nights like this," she said softly. "Not for a crowd, just to remind myself I was still human." He glanced at her. "You don't have to prove that to me." She smiled, surprised. "Most people want me to." "I'm not most people." She nodded. "No, you're not." Silence again, but not the uncomfortable kind. Just two people sitting near each other under the stars, neither needing to explain too much. After a while, Clara began to hum. The notes were low and steady, not for performance, but for peace. Eli didn't speak. He just listened, and when she finished, he said one quiet word, "Beautiful." It didn't feel like flattery. It felt like truth. The following week settled into a gentle rhythm. Clara took on more responsibility, not just with Martha's care, but around the ranch. She helped mend fence posts, she learned to ride better, and she even delivered meals to the hands working the far pasture. The ranch hands, at first wary of her, began to soften. One old rancher, Gus, nodded to her after a full plate of stew and muttered, "Cook better than my wife ever did." "Don't tell her I said that." Clara laughed. But it wasn't just the chores or the praise that healed her. It was the freedom to be useful, to be seen for what she did instead of where she'd come from. And Eli, he remained steady, quiet, watching, helping. He never crossed the line, never pushed her to talk about her past, never treated her like she needed fixing. But every now and then, he'd ask a question that made her pause. "What made you leave Wichita? Did you ever want to sing somewhere other than a saloon? Do you believe people change?" And sometimes, when she asked him questions back about his wife, his loss he would answer in pieces. Not everything, but enough to tell her that he was healing too. One evening, after a long day of gathering herbs for Martha's medicine, Clara sat on the porch playing a tune on Eli's mother's old harmonica. It was clumsy and slow, but sweet. Eli stepped out and stood beside her, watching the horizon burn gold with sunset. "This place was quiet before you came," he said. "I can go back to being quiet." She teased, half turning toward him. He shook his head. "No, I think the quiet needed a little music." Clara looked at him, the man who had offered her work when no one else would, who had watched without judgment, who had protected without praise. And something stirred in her chest, not fear, not uncertainty, but hope. Real, solid hope. The kind that grows roots. The prairie had grown warm again. Late summer meant golden skies, dry winds, and long days in the saddle for Eli. For Clara, it meant sun-soaked hours tending the Morgan home, humming as she kneaded dough or read to Martha on the porch. With each passing week, her steps grew lighter. Her shoulders, once tense and guarded, began to loosen. She even caught herself smiling for no reason. Dry Creek hadn't forgiven her, not openly, but the whispers had faded some. The ranch hands respected her now. The preacher's wife, once cool and polite, had dropped off a pie 2 Sundays in a row with a nod instead of a sermon. Clara was building something steady. Something new. Then one afternoon, as the wind curled dust around the front yard and the chickens pecked lazily in the shade, a figure rode in from the east straight up the drive to the Morgan ranch. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw the rider. Tall, cocky in the saddle, wearing a bright red waistcoat and a crooked smile beneath a feathered hat. She knew that smile. Her hands froze mid-pin. Her heart dropped. Warren Blake, the man who used to own the saloon where she sang, the man who called her his nightingale when he was in a good mood and property when he wasn't. He'd once threatened to lock her in the back room if she ever talked about leaving. And now he was here, riding up to her new life like it was his to judge. "Well, if it ain't Miss Clara Barnes," he drawled as he dismounted. "Or should I say, Mrs. Morgan?" She didn't answer. "Not right away," I heard through the grapevine that one of my old girls was playing house with a cowboy, he continued, brushing dust from his coat. "Thought I'd ride by and see for myself." Eli stepped out of the barn a moment later, wiping his hands on a cloth. He clocked the stranger immediately and strode forward without pause. "You're not welcome here," Eli said flatly, stopping between Clara and the visitor. Warren raised a brow. "I'm just here to talk. No harm in saying hello?" Eli didn't flinch. "Say it from the road." Clara stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "What do you want, Warren?" "I'm offering you a job," he said with a smirk. "We're putting together a traveling show. Singing, dancing, high-class entertainment. And you, my dear, were always the star of the room. Thought you might want a stage again. Lord knows you won't find much applause milking cows." Clara's stomach turned. "I'm not for sale anymore." Warren shrugged. "Didn't say you were. Just figured you'd get bored playing nursemaid to an old woman and baking biscuits." Eli stepped closer. "You're done talking." "But—" Warren wasn't finished. "You think this town's forgotten who she is?" he said loudly, looking past Eli to Clara. "You think they'll ever let her be anything but what she was? Don't fool yourself, Cowboy. She's still a saloon girl to every one of 'em, and always will be." Clara clenched her fists. For a split second, shame surged through her. But then something stronger followed fury. Strength. She stepped past Eli and stood face to face with the man who once held her future like a coin purse in his hands. "You don't know me anymore," she said quietly. "You only know who I had to be to survive. I sang in that saloon because I had no family, no options, and no help. I endured your insults, your grabby hands, and your locked doors. And I left. I walked away from it. That means you don't get to talk to me like you still own a piece of me." Warren blinked, caught off guard by the steel in her voice. "I have a job," Clara continued. "I have purpose. I have peace. And for the first time in my life, I don't owe a damn thing to anyone like you." A long silence followed. Then Warren chuckled, lifted his hands in mock surrender, and stepped back toward his horse. "Well, guess I struck a nerve." "You struck nothing," Eli growled. Warren tipped his hat toward Clara. "You ever want to remember what it's like to be wanted, you know where to find me." He swung onto his saddle and rode off, dust curling in. His wake. Eli turned to Clara, concern in his eyes. "You all right?" She looked up at him, still breathing hard. But her eyes were clear. "I'm better than I've ever been," she said, "because I didn't run, and I didn't stay quiet." He nodded. "You stood your ground." "For?" "Once, I wasn't afraid of my past," she whispered. Eli met her gaze, and something passed between them, then something unspoken, steady, and real, respect, and maybe more, because Clara hadn't just rejected Warren's offer. She'd faced the ghost of who she was and left it standing in the dust, dry. Creek's annual harvest dance was the event of the season. Every fall, the townsfolk gathered in the church hall cleared of pews, lined with lanterns and humming, with the scent of roasted apples and cinnamon. Bachelors wore their best vests. Girls tied ribbons in their hair. Fiddles sang until midnight, and for one evening, even grudges were set aside under the sway of music and warm pie. Clara hadn't planned on going. After the confrontation with Warren Blake, she'd felt exposed again. Old shame threatened to creep back into her bones like a cold wind. The town had seen her past thrown in her face, and while Eli stood beside her without flinching, Clara knew how quickly whispers traveled. So when Martha asked, "You going to the dance this year?" Clara had just shaken her head. "Why not?" Martha pressed, one brow raised from her rocking chair. "I don't think I'd be welcome," Martha scoffed. "You've cleaned my linens, fed half this ranch, and healed the heart of a grieving boy who hasn't smiled in years. If that's not welcome, I don't know what is." Clara smiled at that, but her hand stayed folded in her lap. "It's not that simple." "It is," Martha said. "People don't get to keep you in the past unless you agree to stay there." Still, when the evening of the dance arrived, Clara busied herself with chores. She baked bread, fed the chickens, and scrubbed the stovetop twice. Anything to keep from thinking about the music drifting in from town. Just as she was folding the last dish towel, she heard boots on the porch. She turned and froze. Eli stood in the doorway. Not in his usual work clothes. He wore a dark blue vest over a crisp white shirt, his hair combed back, his hat freshly brushed. He looked handsome, clean in a way she hadn't seen him before. But his eyes were the same steady, unreadable, soft around the edges. He said nothing for a moment, then stepped inside and held something out in his hand. A ribbon. Pale yellow. Soft as silk. I found this in May's old chest. Thought it might suit you. Clara looked at it, stunned. Eli, I'm going to the dance, he said simply, and I'd like to dance with you. Her throat tightened. People will talk. Let 'em. She took the ribbon with trembling fingers. I don't have a proper dress. I don't care about proper. I care about you. Clara stared at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw no hesitation, no pity. Just quiet conviction. So she changed. She pulled out her best skirt, simple but clean. She let her hair down and tied the ribbon at the back. Then, without another word, she walked out the door beside Eli, his hand offering quiet strength as she stepped into the wagon. When they arrived at the church hall, the music was all ready. Playing fiddles and banjos, laughter spilling into the night air. But as Eli and Clara entered, the room fell into a hush. Conversations froze. Eyes turned. A few women exchanged whispers behind gloved hands. Clara's spine straightened. Her fingers tensed in Eli's. He leaned close and said softly, "Don't look at them. Look at me." And then, without waiting for approval, he walked her straight to the center of the floor. The music slowed. And Eli Morgan, the quietest man in town, took the so-called saloon girl in his arms and began to dance. Gasps rippled through the room. But the fiddlers, to their credit, kept playing. The tune was gentle, steady. And in Eli's arms, Clara remembered how to move not like she was performing, but like she was allowed to be seen. He held her like she was precious. Not like a secret, not like a shame, but like a woman he'd been waiting for. By the second verse. A few other couples joined them. By the third, the murmurs had faded, and by the end of the song, Clara's cheeks were flushed with something that had nothing to do with embarrassment. Joy. Real. Unexpected. Earned joy. When the dance ended, Eli didn't let go right away. He looked into her eyes and said quietly, "You belong here more than anyone." Clara's throat tightened. "Why me, Eli? Why did you ever come to that riverbank?" His voice was low. "Because you didn't ask for anything, but you deserved everything." And in that moment, beneath lantern light and long-held silence, Clara knew this wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a rescue. It was honor. It was hope. And maybe it was the beginning of love. Autumn settled across Dry Creek in waves of gold. The air turned cooler. The grass faded to straw, and mornings began with mist curling low over the pasture fences. Life on the Morgan ranch moved slower, quieter, yet for Clara, everything inside her was stirring. It had been nearly 3 months since Eli found her by the river. 3 months since she'd unpacked her trunk into the guest room. 3 months since she dared to laugh, to sing, to let herself be seen. And in that time, the world had shifted. She wasn't just the saloon girl anymore, not to the ranch hands who thanked her for warm meals, or to Martha, who now refused to take her medicine from anyone else. And especially not to Eli, who had never once called her anything but her name. He didn't press. He didn't chase. He simply stayed working beside her, listening when she spoke, standing between her and the town's judgment like a wall of quiet, unshakable calm. It wasn't the kind of love you read about in dime novels. It was slower, truer, built not on fiery words but on unspoken trust, and that made it harder to ignore. One afternoon, as the leaves began to fall in earnest, Clara stood on the porch with her hands wrapped around a warm cup of cider. She watched Eli in the yard, kneeling beside a fence post he was reinforcing. His shirt clung to him in the breeze, and the easy rhythm of his movements was comforting, familiar. She didn't realize she was staring until Martha's voice spoke from behind. You're in love with him." Clara turned. "What?" Martha was seated in her rocker, knitting half-forgotten in her lap. "You look at him the way my mother looked at my father, like you finally found the one place your soul can breathe." Clara flushed. "He's been kind to me, that's all." "Oh, hush," Martha said, waving a hand. "Kindness is one thing. Risking your name and ranch to protect a woman the town can't even speak about without whispering? That's something else entirely." Clara's eyes dropped to her cider. "Don't be afraid of it," Martha added gently. "Men like Eli, they don't say much. But when they act, they mean it." Later that evening, Clara set the table for supper like always. Martha sat near the fire, and Eli came in from the barn just as the last light of day bled orange over. The horizon they ate in comfortable silence, the clink of spoons and the soft crackle of the hearth the only sounds. When the dishes were cleared, and Martha had dozed off with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, Clara found herself alone with Eli on the porch once more. He stood leaning on the post, the brim of his hat tilted back, his face thoughtful in the dusk. Clara joined him, fingers laced in front of her. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He glanced at her. "This ranch? This place? Dry Creek, the way people talk." He shook his head slowly. "Let them talk. But what if they never stop?" Eli looked at her fully now. "They don't get to decide how I live, Clara, or who I build my life with." Her heart beat faster. "And who would that be?" He stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the warmth from his body, even in the cool night air. "You," he said simply. The wind rustled through the leaves. A horse nickered in the distance. Clara stared at him, eyes searching. "You know everything they say about me." "I do. And it doesn't matter?" "What matters is how you've carried yourself since you got here. What matters is that you work hard, love deeply, and never once asked for pity. That kind of strength, that kind of grace, I want that in my life, every day." Her throat caught. "Eli." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a ring. Simple. Gold, no stone, worn smooth. "It was my mother's," he said. "She said when I found a woman who could bring music back to the house, I'd know." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "I ain't asking for an answer tonight," he added. "Just wanted you to know what's in my heart." Clara took the ring slowly, held it in her palm like something sacred. Then dashed quietly. Deliberately, she slipped it onto her finger. "You just got your answer." And under the pale stars of a western sky, Clara Barnes, once rejected, once ridiculed, became a woman chosen. Not because she was flawless, but because she was finally free to be loved. Clara stood barefoot on the porch of the Morgan Ranch, watching the sky shift from purple to gold. It was the same land she'd arrived on months ago, dusty, wine-bitten, wrapped in silence, but it no longer felt like exile. Now it felt like home, inside the house. Martha Morgan's laughter echoed faintly as she argued with the ranch hands over a card game. Clara had just brought out fresh cornbread and sweet tea. She heard Gus complain, "You're feeding us so good, we'll never fit in the saddle again." Clara smiled. Everything had changed, and yet some things remained exactly as they should. The town of Dry Creek never gave her a formal apology. There were still a few eyes that watched her with suspicion when she visited the general store. Still a few women who crossed the street rather than nod in her direction, but most of the town had come around in their own quiet ways. The preacher's wife had asked Clara to help organize the next quilting circle. A young couple from church had asked her to sing at their wedding. Even old Mr. Jeffries from the general store started calling her Miss Clara instead of that woman from Wichita. Respect didn't come quickly. It came daily earned, step by steady step, And through it all, Eli was beside her. Their engagement had stirred more gossip, of course, but no one dared question Eli Morgan's heart, not after seeing the way he watched Clara from across the question Eli Morgan's heart. Room like she was the only steady thing in a spinning world. They didn't have a big wedding. Just a few close friends under the cottonwoods where Eli had once stood and watched her rebuild her fire pit. Martha officiated herself, quoting scripture, and tossing sass in equal measure. Clara wore a blue dress and the yellow ribbon Eli had once given her. Eli wore the same vest from the harvest dance and a smile no one had seen in years. When they exchanged vows, there were no flowery words, no promises too big to keep, just honesty. "I don't need to be saved," Clara said, voice trembling. "Just seen." "I've seen you since the day you didn't cry at that train station," Eli replied. "And I'll keep seeing you for the rest of my life." They kissed as the prairie wind wrapped around them like a blessing. Weeks passed. Then months. Life on the ranch found its rhythm again. Clara planted flowers outside the porch and herbs. In the kitchen window, she sang while she cooked. She mended shirts with care and helped the ranch hands learn to read in the evenings. One dog-eared book at a time. Eli still didn't say much, but he didn't need to. Every time he took her hand without asking. Every time he poured her coffee before she sat down. Every time he stood beside her in church, unflinching. She felt it. One morning, as they sat on the porch sipping coffee, Eli said, "You know what I remember most about you at that river?" Clara looked up. "What? You never asked for help." "I didn't think I deserved any." He turned to her, eyes soft. "Well, you're the strongest woman I know." "But no one earns love, Clara. They just receive it. And you're mine now." She blinked, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. Then she smiled. "And you're mine." Later that fall, they built a small cabin near the cottonwoods just beyond sight of the river where she'd first made camp. It was a place for quiet mornings and slow evenings. A place for her music. A place where their story could begin again, but on their terms. Clara sometimes walked alone down by the riverbank, where the stones from her first fire pit still sat. She never moved them. They were her reminder of what she came from, of what she endured, and of the man who didn't flinch when he saw the ashes of her past, because he saw the fire she still carried inside. That girl who stepped off the train with nothing but a trunk and a damaged name, she didn't just survive. She became something new, respected, loved, and finally, home.